I invite you into moments of wholeheartedness. Just a moment where it's not complex. A moment where the heart is humble and simple and is delighted. Child has learned to walk. That a community is singing together. That leadership has arisen in places. Clear-minded, big-hearted people. Just see if you can tap into a breath or two at a time of simple appreciation and celebration of what's good in the world.
I'm really excited to bring you the upcoming interview with a very special guest. You'll hear him discussing all the great and courageous work that he's currently engaged in. And if you feel inspired to help him continue these efforts, please consider making a donation earmarked for his projects. Or you can give a general donation that will support the wider movement in Myanmar. Our ongoing support has been so very helpful and appreciated by many Burmese struggling during these dark days. Simply go to insightmyanmar.org/donation to contribute today, or stay tuned at the end of the episode to hear more options. Now, let's hear from that guest himself. You're listening to part 2 of my interview with Tempel Smith. If you have not done so already, I suggest you go back and listen to part 1. With that, let's get into the interview.
Appreciate your describing all the tensions that we're working out. And as you said, that's pretty normal for a 20-year-old to have all those things inside oneself and not to have them sorted out. But for me, it became really unbearable to not have more harmony inside to meet my activist self or my quiet wilderness living retreat self, and to have these arguments about Marxist commitment to protesting and some societal pressures to just settle down, get a job, and participate. And so that probably sounds like a 20-year-old mind, but being fed by some very powerful forces that were hard to resolve. And one of those tensions would be if I ever hung out with my activist friends, they wouldn't understand why I would spend so much time on a silent retreat. And to them, they were worried that I was cooling off the anger needed to be a steady activist. And there was something indulgent about it. And then when I hung out with my meditator friends, and I would talk to them about the beauty of engaging their hearts and seeing the Dharma flow through by taking on social causes or environmental causes, to them it was all too messy and too stimulating, and they were having a hard time just keeping their mind together in the lifestyle they had. And so the resolution points came when I found people in the Buddhist Peace Fellowship who were looking at socially engaged Buddhism and reading other people trying to bring these sides of the Dharma together. A few friends I had were very helpful. But what was really helpful was actually seeing the mind that would be torn apart by trying to hold polarities and then end up in the hindrance of doubt. And not just the doubt of not knowing what you want to have for lunch, but the doubt that was really tormenting, relentlessly tormenting, like claws being drawn through your mind over and over again. Should I be more committed? Should I try the Goenka style? It was very powerful, but hard to integrate. Should I try the Mahasi style? Of the Mahasi style, should I be working on concentration? Should I be working on insight? Should I be more relaxed, as some of my teachers are saying? Should I cut down on my sleep, like other people are saying? And then trying to meet my familial desires that my parents were a little bit anxious about how intensely I was being drawn into Buddhism and a little bit skeptical of religious fervor, wondering if I was becoming incompetent as a North American adult, and I'd been given all this privilege of education and I could plug in. I was a good scientist. Maybe I was obsessed with something that was unattainable. And so my 20s just, I felt so torn by this. But the best resolution was either a good friend who could be in that channel with you. So Diana Winston was really helpful in talking through these things and sharing the questions. But really, it was only meditative moments. And those meditative moments could come on a retreat, very reliable that I would get resolution on the retreat. Maybe the second half would feel more resolved, or I could hold complexity and I could see the truth of neuroscience, but it wasn't the whole picture. See the truth of Marxist analysis, but it wasn't the whole picture. Seeing the truth of trying to fix samsara and seeing the truth that samsara wasn't fixable. There would be moments on retreat where it would all make sense. And there'd be this huge quietude coming where there's just so much inner conflict. But I could also feel that sometimes in very intensive service and activism, where it would all make sense inside the homeless shelter, why I was meditating so much, because it allowed me to spend that much more quality time with a teenager who was homeless and had just given birth, and see the lack of her resources, feel the pain and the fear in her, but I could actually be there with her and feel like that was something she'd never felt before. So it could happen. That's when I knew I was the Dharma path. When I was on it, all these things would make sense. And if I strayed off it, I would start to be torn apart by something being betrayed. If I tried to resolve everything just by the seclusion of retreat or wilderness living, I'd be betraying the heart that cared for the world. If I tried to care for the world, I'd be overextended and insecure and scattered. And the only way any of it was tolerable, but then also became very inspiring, is when I had a Dharma view that embraced it all. And that's when the sanity of those moments and the contrast of the terror and the doubt of not having those moments really became the conviction of why I went to Burma and why I wanted to ordain, that there was really there's no choice I could make that wouldn't unify everything on the pressure that everything wanted to be unified, that every part of me was desperate to be realized, and they were in conflict unless I approached life in a certain way. And that looked a lot more increasingly like I have to have a certain amount of time in meditation every day. And I heard from a few people that if you do 2 hours of meditation a day, you can hold your practice steady. But if you can do 3 or 4 hours a day, you actually feel the progression. Never done that. I've only done intensive retreat or not being on retreat. But I thought, okay, I think my dream life is half the day spent in meditation and then the other half doing some type of service or some type of participation in the world. And both of them give each other context and purpose that you can't find in just doing the one. But I also am doing the long retreats thought, I think the fastest way for me to get where I want to go is to commit to deep, intensive Burmese-style meditation, break through some of these habits, and then find a more integrated lifestyle. And that was the best my 20-year-old mind could come up with. And my friends at the Buddhist Peace Fellowship had talked about some period. Everybody had had a period where they'd really gone deep into the formal part of practice. And that mapped onto my own temperament. Um, and then the choices were where to go, how to do this. And there weren't really good ways to do that yet in North America in the traditions of insight meditation that really worked for my mind. And so the only question was, if you want to do a year or more of practice at the level you want to do it, still you have to do that in Asia, possibly in England in the Ajahn Chah tradition. But so much of their practice was daily life living. It was already the integrative model. That may not do justice to what they were actually doing, but they didn't put as much emphasis as the Burmese did on this very powerful submersion model of satipatthana or jhana practice for weeks on end, months on end. The Ajahn Chah tradition, they would talk about those periods of practice, but they were also a little bit skeptical of only doing that. But by temperament, I was really starved for it. I was hungry for it. And so I only could really recognize that kind of practice in Burma. And then I didn't know what to do other than everybody at that time was working with one of two teachers, everybody from the West that I knew of. They were working with U Janaka, who was a student of Mahasi Sayadaw, or they're working with U Pandita. And U Janaka's approach also seemed like it was very invested in daily life under the microscope of intensive practice. So you might take 10 minutes to get dressed, really feeling every intention to lift your pants, to button them, to feel the cold of the metal of the zipper as you zip them up, if you're wearing Western style clothing. Or you would take an hour and a half to eat a meal. And so actually sitting and walking practice was there just to support slowing down into what you would do during a day. And if you could do less sitting and walking, but you slow down anything else, that was valid. So that was one option. But everybody at Insight Meditation Society was still talking about U Pandita being the teacher's teacher, the fast track. Everybody's practice had accelerated under his teaching, and it was a little bit sad in hindsight because I was just starting to learn about loving kindness practice. And I was just starting to learn about a little bit more balanced effort. I was just starting to get teachers recognizing that I was too willful, too intense. And in 1996, I was feeling this dawning intuition that if I slowed down, I could actually cultivate the mind like a garden as intensively as I wanted, but I could still find balanced effort and watch the Dharma unfold inside me. But my older temperament was to be very willful. So it was a new lesson. And then when I went to work with U Pandita, people said, just tell him that and he'll figure you out and you'll get the teachings you need. And there was so much love and appreciation of U Pandita at the time that I don't think the advice I got was actually tailored to me. Um, so I went with Diana Winston. We went right from the airport to the monastery. We had an afternoon of getting supplies that we would need. And then we just plugged in to waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning, practicing till 9 or 10 at night, just going right into the U Pandita style of practice. And it was familiar to me to practice like that. I'd done that with Goenka. I'd done that with certain teachers at IMS, it was an older temperament of mine to be very willful and to tackle every moment and press my mind in every moment to be focused and attentive and analytical. And so I thought, okay, if U Pandita is the teacher's teacher and knows everybody and everybody benefits as much as they say, he'll figure out what I need. And I practiced with incredible strenuousness and still felt like I was a lazy practitioner from how U Pandita would describe what was necessary for awakening. And so he did get a lot more effort out of me, much more Dhamma investigation. I was gritting my teeth. I was practicing like my hair was on fire. I was pushing myself. But several months of that practice really made my mind tight, like grinding granite. It felt like it was hard and grinding on the inside. And that brought up a lot of hindrances. And the only tool U Pandita would sort of generally hand out is that the hindrances had to be subdued with effort. So more aiming, more sustaining until you broke the hindrances. And it was very intensive practice. I don't think my meditation practice was balanced enough to be very useful, but I still learned a lot while I was there. And probably the better part of what happened when I was with U Pandita was getting to ordain, getting his caliber of holding the monastic form as diligently as he did, calling me up and forward into the monkhood. That was incredibly profound, and I'm grateful for that. For him, he also taught me a lot about working with the second foundation of mindfulness, Vedana, and he didn't give me any type of slack. So if something was painful, he made me experience it and investigate it ruthlessly. If something was pleasant, I had to attack it with mindfulness. And so I learned a lot about the second foundation of mindfulness that not a lot of people in the West train with it, train with the second foundation. I think people experience pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. But I don't think people are held accountable to pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral like the Burmese are willing, or not just willing, but are accustomed to holding students.
So I think as we move from your story involving these budding tensions and contrasts that are in the American scene, this is the American movie of staying stateside and developing in the way that you were there. And then you take yourself completely outside, not only of the American dynamic as a country, but also the American context as a style of practice. And even more than that, moving beyond lay practitioner, but becoming a monk. And so this is really shaking things up in a profound way, not to mention the fact that you're going in to try to try to do a year course, to try to give yourself a tremendous momentum in the practice and dedicate yourself for an extended period. So this is a pretty profound shift and a pretty profound change from being within one system where you have a lot of these tensions and contrasts that you're working out to removing yourself entirely from that. Not that those tensions and contrasts go away, but that you're not confronted with them in the same way because you're not going from American practitioners on retreat to American engaged activists that are protesting some social injustice. You're removing yourself from that kind of context. So just stepping back in general and looking overall at this big geographic and cultural shift at that time, and then also moving the conversation to Burma specifically, to Burma as a country, as a culture, as a people, as a group of monastic institutions, the teachers that were there. What stands out from of making this journey of going from of continuing on your life path and spiritual path, but in going from the West and America specifically to the East and to Burma specifically, what stands out in what really was quite a major transition, and coming at a time, I assume this was sometime around the late 90s, if I'm still following the trajectory, that would not have been the easiest time to come in Burma. Certainly easier than it was 10 years previous, but not as easy as it would be 10 years in the future. So what was that whole experience and journey like?
Yeah, that was also an interesting chapter, because when I'd done both 3-month meditation retreats, I came and lived in San Francisco for 9 months in a program the Buddhist Peace Fellowship had put on, where they wanted to create a Buddhist Peace Corps inside America, and they wanted to raise the money to house people in a very um, thrifty way. So I moved to San Francisco, did this program, worked with homeless kids in San Francisco on a very small stipend, and it met a lot of my needs. It was good. But then once that program wrapped up, and I was talking to my friend Diana, I said, "Now what do I do?" Because I know that if I don't do more retreat, I'm just going to get entangled. But I don't want to do another 3 month retreat. Like, I know I have an intuition. I have to go deeper, but I also don't want to disappear into just meditation world. And I was very lucky to talk with Diana, because she had spent a year and a half thinking about this herself, and she had this whole plan for herself to work with U Pandita in Burma, attain some type of liberation through intensive practice. And then she was going to go all across Asia visiting Buddhist sites of engagement. Um, and there were, hundreds of places that local forms of Buddhism had taken on environmental or social programs. And so we were talking about this, and we were walking through San Francisco one day, and I was talking out loud in these questions. She said, "Well, it sounds like you want to do what I'm about to do." And she was leaving in 1 month for Burma. And I had up to that point the sense, I don't think we need to go far away to wake up. I think we should be able to wake up right where we are, but I don't see the practice modality of that. And so in that conversation, it just clicked inside me. I said, "Okay, in 1 month, I'm going to be on that plane with you. How do I do it?" And she said, "Well, come with me. Pandita's here. We have to go down to San Jose, get his permission to practice with him. He'll give us a document. We apply for the visa." And luckily, she had done all this background work to actually figure out how to do it. And I jumped on her coattails and did everything that she'd planned out with her. And she was happy to have the company. And it kind of mapped on, and it mapped onto my temperament as well. Like, I'd never done much camping before I went on my first intensive wilderness trip. And I'd never done any Buddhism before I went on my first 9-day retreat. I tended to have a temperament of leaping in and then figuring out why I'd leaped in hindsight. So she was going to work with U Pandita in Burma. She knew which plane to be on. She knew how to get there, how to apply for the visa. We went down, we talked with U Pandita. I met him for the first time. We described that we'd both been on several 3-month meditation retreats. He gave us permission to come work with him in Burma. I really had not done any type of research to know what it looked like. I just heard stories from my teachers, but that's a very imperfect picture and idealized of what that looked like. But having done 2 3-month retreats, I felt I'll figure it out. I'll be oriented enough to figure it out as much as anybody has. And luckily, Diana has actually done some really hard logistical training into looking at what we needed to bring, how to actually physically get there, contacting the monastery so they'll pick us up from the airport. And so I only had a month between the inception of the idea to where I was getting on the plane to Burma. And it's a bit of my diluted temperament that sometimes I jump into things without even knowing the size of what I'm initiating. But there's a yes inside of me, and I'm so relieved to have that yes that I don't mind the complications that come with finding a yes that's as big as my heart wants. And so going to Burma, practicing for a year, and then getting involved with a Buddhist community that was doing profound social justice work or service work or environmental work. And I was burned out of the United States. The Reagan years had really crushed the sense that um, idealism was really going to take hold in America. I had several romantic relationships that very quickly got very complicated. I liked being by myself, loved being in the wilderness. And being a renunciate as a monk was actually easier than being a renunciate as a wilderness canoer. There you're sleeping on the flat ground, maybe with a thermarest, mosquitoes. I was like, what haven't I faced in the raw wilderness of Canada that I'll face in Burma? And it was true. It was about on par. Um, so I had enough intuition that it will work out or it won't. But it's the only thing that appears like whatever my next step could be. And it takes care of some things. It introduces some problems and challenges, but I was already feeling challenged about staying in the States and pursuing all the things that I wanted to pursue. So the next thing I knew, I had to talk to my family about what I was about to do. Those were hard conversations. I was scrambling to try to close down my North American life, possibly indefinitely. There was a sense that maybe if I liked being ordained in Burma, I might not come back, and at least better head over to there with that, knowing that's a possibility. So I then had to speak to my family about that while I was still trying to discover what it was I had just agreed to. I had to allay the fears of my parents, my own fears about their fears, and then be competent enough to show up there and gracefully show up in Burma. And again, Diana had done a lot more work, but luckily they met us at the airport. They drove us right to the U Pandita city monastery in Yangon. They gave us a room. We had lunch. They took us by taxi into town to get certain supplies that we needed as lay people. We handed over our money, so the office kept our travelers' checks and whatever money we had brought. And we were told to then sit for an hour, walk for an hour, sit for an hour, walk for an hour, go into noble silence. And from that, you didn't have to figure out all of Burmese culture, Burmese context. You only had to figure out what was expected and what was appropriate inside this very formalized culture of U Pandita's monastery, where the rules are very clear. You sit for an hour, you walk for an hour, you sit for an hour, walk for an hour, you have an interview every day, every other day. This is your meal time. This is how you eat. And they let Westerners be a little sloppy, but if you were used to being on intensive retreat, as both of us had learned how to do by the previous 3-month retreats, you just kind of plug in and sit for an hour, walk for an hour, eat your meals at these times. And for that, actually didn't have to learn anything about Burmese culture except what was relevant inside the monastery. And if you walk slowly enough, eat slowly enough, and do the prescripted practice, you get pointers along the way, but you pretty much don't ruffle a lot of feathers. You don't make a lot of mistakes if you basically plug in to the ongoing retreat format that they have. And both of us roughly knew how to do that. I would say of myself that I have a parami of renunciation that allows me to do with as little as possible for whatever makes the context I'm in simple. So it was not hard to fit into whatever the Burmese expected. They were incredibly generous and warm and encouraging. So there was both a sense that they were very happy to have us there, very tolerant of us answering what few questions we had, showing us how to do the small customs within the monastery. And then Burma was just a completely unexamined phenomena outside the monastery walls that you would never hear about because it wasn't in the Dharma talks. There was no time for communication and no time to talk with Burmese people. So then you're almost in this hermetically sealed container inside this radically different culture. But the actual activity of sitting for an hour, walking for an hour, examining your breath was familiar enough that it's like, okay, this is what they're expecting. This is what they want. They don't want me to know about Burma. They don't want me to walk outside the monastery. They don't want me to learn the language. They don't want me to engage with anything outside of sitting for an hour, walking for an hour. And that was, in hindsight, that was a very odd thing to do, very disorienting, but makes total sense in the context of what the whole reason for going there was, and what was culturally generous and respectful to take their offering, which was, we will support you in this, especially if you're a sincere practitioner. And so rather than learning their language and their customs and getting to know the culture around me as a culturally astute thing to do, to actually not let my mind go there was more conducive to the generosity I was being shown. So then Burma was a complete unknowable culture except when I ordained. And I didn't understand that. When I ordained, I didn't understand what I was signing up for, except for the stories I'd heard. So the first 2 months I practiced as a layperson, I don't know if there's time for a funny story, but I was a layperson doing my intensive practice. And then I had a question about ordaining. And I said, well, I might as well get educated about this process of ordaining. I have it as a background idea. And the teacher in the monastery at the time, who wasn't U Pandita, this was in his forest monastery, said, well, you should bring this up with U Pandita. He's coming tomorrow, and he can answer all your questions better than I can. So in your interview tomorrow, say that you're interested and could you have a conversation about ordination? And I took the cue and I said, yeah, that sounds like a very, I'll trust him and his guidance. So I went into the interview the next day and I said, Sayadaw, I have a question about ordaining. I'm curious about the process and I want to receive your advice about ordaining. And he said, okay, it will happen tomorrow. And there's a translator translating his Burmese into English, and I worried that I hadn't framed the question right,
Right.
or I'd heard the advice correctly. And so I repeated it. As I said, well, I need to learn about this, or I'm not totally sure. And he said, best if we do it tomorrow, ordaining. And so in being submerged in deep practice, at that point, everything's about the flow of the present moment and saying yes to it. And then he said, do you have permission from your parents to ordain? And I said, my dad would love it. I think my mom wouldn't. And he said, okay, well, you need to get her permission before we can ordain you. So you talk to her tomorrow. And at that time, you had to talk to someone in the monastery, they would talk to a Burmese operator. They would set up a time where you could have a 5-minute call to the States. And so out of the blue, I call my mother and I have 5 minutes to say, hello, I'm fine. How's the family? Yes, I'm doing fine. I'm having a good time. And by the way, I'm having such a good time here that I'm contemplating ordaining as a monk, but they need your permission for me to ordain. And this is like 4 minutes and 10 seconds into the call. And she said, oh, I've had Asian grad students. I know that family structure is very important to them. Of course, I give you permission. And I said, thanks so much. And I'll keep you informed how things go. And sorry, the 5 minutes are up. I'll call again at some point. And the phone went dead. And I learned later on that when the phone went dead, she burst into tears, and that she had done something very gracious in that moment to give me permission for my own agency in life, but that it just terrified her that she was losing me to a Buddhist cult in the jungles of Burma. My family spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I had just done, and I only had a 5-minute window to even. And when I last talked to them, I was heading over to Burma, possibly a year, do some travel, explore meditation. They were okay with that. But now I was ordaining as a formal monk, and I had to broker all that within 5 minutes. And she said yes. And that meant that I could ordain. And next thing I knew, I was going through the ordination process. And like my leap into Burma, now I was leaping into ordination. And I couldn't see a reason to say no. So said yes to the training.
And then you became a Buddhist monk in Burma for a year.
Yeah. And there were parts in that were so beautiful, like being able to leave the monastery every day, soften some of my intensity, and being so locked up inside the practice. So being able to walk through the villages every morning, going in alms run, receiving the generosity of the Burmese people every day, exercising, opening my perspective, some interaction with humanity, again, was really incredibly sweet. And after 4 more months of practicing with U Pandita, as a monk and learning his style and his technique, I realized that there was no way I could practice with him without being too aggressive in my practice. And I couldn't give myself enough permission to relax within his style. And I was talking to a Dutch monk about this. And he said, oh, you should go practice at the Pa Auk Monastery. They teach loving kindness practice. They have a very different method. And before you leave Burma, because I didn't know what else to do, he said, at least go visit Pa Auk Monastery. And I thought, oh, that'd be great just for my own edification to see different styles of practice. I'll travel down there, learn some things about their style of practice, but then I'll go to Thailand and find a monastery that's more socially engaged. So I was sort of opening, I give myself permission to leave the U Pandita monastery and go visit the Pa Auk Monastery. That brought up a whole challenge with U Pandita, that I was wanting to leave his monastery and go to another monastery, and that brought in a whole challenging dynamic between us around that. But he gave his permission, and I went down to visit the Pa Auk Monastery, was so impressed by what they taught there that I moved down there and stayed 6 more months down at Pa Auk Monastery. And that's where I did the second half of my year ordained.
So that was the year in Burma.
That was the year in Burma. Is 6 months with U Pandita, a month of traveling around between the monasteries because I could, and then 6 more months with Pa Auk Sayadaw. Really appreciate being able to talk through this story again with somebody who's mapping it as well as you are. There's not so many people who are
Oh, thanks.
who hear that. So there's sort of like it's almost therapeutic to be able to tell this story with an interested person. Most people just don't have bandwidth for an arc that goes through this. So once I realized I wanted to leave U Pandita's monastery, still wasn't sure what step was next, and thought I could use my monastic visa to get to know the country, which felt respectful. And I still wasn't totally certain of what my next place was going to be, back to the States or looking at communities in Thailand. But I knew I needed to kind of catch my breath after being in such intensive work with U Pandita. So uh, um, another monk told me about the Pa Auk Monastery in southern Burma. That area of Burma had just gone through a ceasefire of decades of war, and it had opened up a chance for Westerners to go that far south in Burma. And then so this talk of the Pa Auk method and this Pa Auk monastery, where they let you train in loving kindness before you go deep into Vipassana practice. And that was not done in the Mahasi or Ubakin way, as far as I understand. What was taught in popular Burma didn't let people do submersive jhana practice before they had attained some type of stream entry or deep progress of insight in their intensive vipassana form. And then everybody, you just keep hearing people talking about a certain monastery, and it kind of grows in your mind like, well, that's really curious. So they'll let you practice loving kindness practice for years on end. And like, yeah, however long it takes to actually develop jhana, these deep states of meditation. And it's like they also do corpse reflections. It's like, well, I've heard about that, but I've never done it. And they also do, I was like, well, I've heard about all these styles of meditation, but I didn't know anybody actually taught them. Like, when would you actually get a chance to do that? And the stories about the Pa Auk Meditation Center was that they teach the whole Theravadan map. So that was kind of enticing. And there's this beautiful moment where I got to travel halfway down to the Pa Auk Monastery, was going to see the balancing golden rock, this beautiful pagoda inside Burma, this balancing rock on the edge of a cliff. And I went down there as a monk. So now I'm a fully ordained monk, but I'm traveling through the country on the generosity of Burmese people, and to see them hand me off with reverence, but also the care of a child, from one group to another. And they each would take me a little step of the way. And I got to see the balancing rock. It was beautiful. Met some Pa Auk students there who were on their own pilgrimage, and they took me the other way. So now I'm a fully ordained monastic. I'm outside of the intensive practice mode, and I can start to see the impact my mind has had that I couldn't see inside the monastery, because I'm traveling with these people and my mind is really clean of greed, hatred, delusion. I'm back out in the world, learning a little bit more about Burmese customs and being patiently taught how to be gracious inside Burmese culture. And I get to the Pa Auk Monastery, and I'm really, at that point, just coming to spend 2 weeks there just to roughly learn how they practice. But I wasn't there for another round of committed practice. I'd just done a lot, 6 months. And so I got to the Pa Auk Monastery, and the whole feeling of the monastery was very different. People were engaged in conversation with each other. People's body language was very relaxed. They talked to me, whereas with U Pandita's monastery, it was, you talk to other people as little as possible. But I noticed when I was visiting the Pa Auk Monastery, people had time to kind of talk about my meditative experiences, their meditative experiences, pulled out Pali Canon and Visuddhimagga books, and we would look through them. I was like, wow, this is a study monastery as far as I can guess, because nobody looks like they're practicing by moving slowly and being very internal. But then people would tell me about their meditative experience with such incredible clarity. And they started listening to my meditative experience and started positing guesses at what I was having. It was really helpful. Um, and so after 2 weeks there, I had a complete change of heart. I thought, something's happening here in this monastery, and I really don't think I understand it. But there, the way that people are talking about practice and using the discourses, and they're in more active community together, whereas with U Pandita, there wasn't really an active sense of community. You were a very ferocious, solitary practitioner inside a community of other intensive practitioners, but there was no communing with each other. There was very little. But at the Pa Auk Monastery, people had warm relationships with each other, but they also had phenomenal meditative depth and insight, but the modality was very different. And so being at Pa Auk, I started learning about a whole sets of Theravadan meditative techniques that were not focused on Vipassana practice, but they were focused on developing deep states of meditative absorption. And the way you practice that is different. It's not strenuously analytical. It's about soothing the mind, simplifying the mind, letting the mind come to more peace by giving it really simple things to do. And while that's embedded in the Mahasi techniques and in the Goenka techniques, you're also then analyzing things into their small components when you're doing Mahasi and Goenka. So you're doing both at the same time, whereas at the Pa Auk Monastery, people were taking months to just simplify their attention, months to soothe their mind. And there would be some analysis of what was lacking, what would be helpful, but you could also overanalyze, which is what, when I first came into the Pa Auk Monastery, I still had U Pandita's training. I was still hearing what they were saying from U Pandita's lens of strenuous effort and in rigorous analysis of moment by moment experience. So it took several months of practicing there where I began to see that they really didn't want me to do that. That they said that will come later when you do the Pa Auk version of Vipassana. But actually, right now, we want you just to do the soothing part of the practice, just to simplify your attention and let it absorb into its practice. So I did a month of loving kindness practice, and I did a month of body awareness practice, and I did a month of breath practice. And that's all I was supposed to do. I wasn't supposed to fight my mind. I wasn't supposed to be aggressive. There's still a Burmese style of practice, which maybe not in, say, Tejaniya style, where even Pa Auk would use some warrior language about not letting the hindrances push you around or willfully tracking the object of your meditation, like the breath or loving kindness practice. But they also talked a lot more about uh, relaxation. They talked much more about contentment as not the outcome of practice, but an important factor inside of practice, that you should be feeling the experience of contentment. And that's how you know your meditation practice is developing, is there's more contentment. And U Pandita's style of practice promised I would get more content, but the way I was practicing made me more agitated, more mindfully dominant, and I actually wasn't developing a lot more intrinsic contentment. So after a few months of practicing with Pa Auk, I kind of finally started hearing what samathā meditation techniques were actually, how you deepen in them. Samathā meditation techniques are for tranquility, wholeness of attention, leading towards absorption. And I started actually applying the teachings of jhana practice, what's conducive to absorption practice, and then started having my mind reflect that. And within a couple of months of practicing at Pa Auk meditation, I started having these much more beautiful and soothing and content-making meditation practice like I had discovered earlier at Insight Meditation Society. And I understood more of the Theravadan context of using cooling factors of tranquility and concentration and equanimity inside your practice. And so my mind started getting incredibly clear and tranquil. The hindrances started evaporating out of my practices, but not because I fought them, but there was so much billowing up of this clean, present contentment of working with simple objects that I said, yeah, I don't know why I didn't make more progress with U Pandita, but I can feel this style is really working with my mind. And the teachings make a lot of sense to me. I don't feel confused as I did. I don't feel like I'm fighting the tradition as much, trying to balance myself out. And so then these beautiful absorption states started happening. I got the precursor of the internal experience of light that is so important for the Pa Auk tradition, that as the mind becomes still and content and unagitated, there is this byproduct phenomena of an internal light arising. It's like someone's actually turned on a dimmer switch light bulb inside your mind, and you start having the phenomenological experience of this increased light. Um, and so I noticed the light was arising as he said it would. The tranquility was opening up as he said it would. Um, Other things started happening, like started getting some of the psychic powers, which as a physicist, in quantum physics, there's a lot of weird stuff. So even physicists are intellectually open to the universe being weird. But I was very skeptical of the psychic powers that would come with meditation. And those started coming as a byproduct. It was very kind of baffling and enticing to my rigorous, skeptical, scientific mind that I started having premonitions of events. And I was very skeptical that I was fooling myself or just wanting to believe something because everybody was talking about it. But I started having enough psychic ability that it really cracked my skepticism that was all folklore. So they're just silly things like anticipating getting Western chocolate, which never happened in a forest monastery in Burma. Hours before it came, I would start obsessing and mouth-watering over real Western chocolate. And then someone would come in from alms round and is like, you can't even guess what I was given on alms walk. And I would say, you got chocolate, which never happened. And they would produce this huge quantity of chocolate. And anyways, there's a number of stories like this that people started noticing. And that's where it really starts to change the Western perspective on cognitive development, emotional control, a greater sense of presence. Maybe there's more to this Theravadan cosmology than, but you can go pretty far into it from a Western materialist point of view and put aside some of the classical teachings. But when you start experiencing them, it really undermines this view that the Western materialist cosmology actually is the fundamental truth. And so psychic abilities spurious but definite, beautiful states of absorption, clarity about the teachings, feeling the unity of disparate parts of the Dharma feel resolved as my mind got clearer. And it was there that I knew that the greatest faith I had in Theravada was being manifest in the Pa Auk monastic system. And that I loved the other teachings because they were pragmatic and they bootstrapped you into Vipassana. And I was very glad for those early orientations, but I became a complete devotee to giving the mind months and years of samathā development, the role of jhana and absorption in our practice, the healing nature of samadhi, of jhana, and then letting that be the real basis to do refined analytical vipassana meditation. And to be a monk in that monastery while all of this was ripening was a beautiful culmination of the year I spent in Burma. To see it all start snapping together and feeling that devotion to the Buddha, his teachings, the centuries of people practicing it, people rediscovering it at different times and re-encouraging that level of practice. And then to see that it wasn't mythology, that it actually could be, more of it could be possibly true than you might have imagined as a Westerner. Deva realms, again, psychic abilities, a huge transcendent consciousness or experience of consciousness that didn't feel small and egoically compacted. And to have that firsthand experience of it was very confirming to be in his monastery. So I did get a little bit excited and a little bit zealous about the Pa Auk method being the true way. And that just comes with a rush of faith and inspiration. It's hard not to become zealous about something that you're so hopeful of. So I've now had many years to temper that a little bit. But at the time, it was the most beautiful lifestyle I've ever had, to be ordained, go on alms walks, live simply as a monk, have these internal beautiful states come, seeing the teachings confirmed, having teachers and guides that could really steer my mind and my practice as opposed to giving me kind of blunt instructions, one-size-fit-all instructions. So I was so grateful to have taken that chance of going to the Pa Auk Monastery. And I look back and see some of the incredible things that U Pandita trained me in, and have now had many years to appreciate his teachings where I didn't so much at the time or struggled more at the time. But in coming to the Pa Auk Monastery, discovered a lot that refueled and reignited my faith in the Theravadan Dharma.
And this concludes part 2 of my discussion with Tempel Smith. The conversation will continue in part 3. Many listeners know that in addition to running these podcast episodes, we also run a nonprofit, Better Burma, which carries out humanitarian projects across Myanmar. While we regularly post about current needs and proposals from groups on the ground, we also handle emergency requests, often in matters that are quite literally life or death. When those urgent requests come in, we have no time to conduct targeted fundraisers, as these funds are often needed within hours. So please consider helping us to maintain this emergency fund. We want to stress that literally any amount you can give allows us to respond more flexibly and effectively when disaster strikes. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.